Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Coach's Corner. And today's topic going to be a little bit more of a generalized topic. Is going to be about mashing. So, mashing has been quite the topic throughout Ultimate. I think very popular in the first couple of years, and even like as of I would say throughout the whole history of Ultimate. And yeah, so we got the usual crew. We got myself, Bam, Ramses, and Tony. So we can get right into it. I first want to talk about just kind of like the history of mashing. I think throughout all the other Smash games, the top tiers were the only ones that could like mash or spam, as we called it back then, because there's only a handful of characters that really had no end lag to their moves where it was like really really effective. Obviously there's melee where everyone could L cancel, but obviously speedier characters with more impactful openings, are more of the meta. So mashing has always been a thing, and even when you look back at like Brawl Meta Knight or even like the Smash 4 characters, right? Like Diddy, Sheik, Fox, these all these meta characters really could throughout these threatening hitboxes with high reward, but very, very low risk. And now everyone can kind of do that in Ultimate. I would say, like in the first year, especially, it felt like auto L canceling was turned off or turned on, and then so many characters could just throw out moves. Because in Smash 4 and Brawl, other characters, like especially the like mid to lower tier ones, they had so much end lag on their moves, so you're throwing out these big swings, and then you know it was so laggy, so you would just get whiff punished, and then the person whiff punishing you with their speedier character would get higher percentage openings than you do anyway with these bigger hits. So Ultimate, it was weird because the first year came out and then everyone was like, oh wow, maybe heavies will be good, but then eventually heavies like kind of sucked anyway, except maybe like Snake and
As
stuff. But
always.
yeah, the natural course, right? Ness early game was
Wait,
crazy, and then Ness sucked, but like yeah.
Incineroar is better than Palutena, though. I
Oh,
mean,
true. That is a hot topic.
consider it.
That is a
Consider
hot
it.
topic. But yeah, of course, before we get even more into it, if you do like the content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. You guys can also subscribe to our Discord if you guys want to ask us questions. And yeah, let us know how you feel about mashing. Which character do you think is the biggest masher in Super Smash Brothers Ultimate? But yeah, bam. I guess we'll go around the horn and talk about early game mashing, especially early game Ultimate, or if you guys want to talk about, other like mashing in other previous games or just the early meta of Ultimate.
Yeah, man. To me, it's kind of interesting, right? Because I think that the way that we look at mashing in general in the Smash community is a bit perverse because of our experiences in past generation of games. Some things that we call mashing in other games would just be like more active offense, right? In certain cases. But Smash traditionally was like we had a game where essentially if you swing on shield, outside of some like super well spaced stuff or whatever it might be, like that was the end of your turn, right? This game, it's a little bit more like nebulous. You can do things where you can kind of take back your turn. You can do things that are like actual frame traps, right? A lot of times when we use frame traps, we talk about it in a way of air dodge traps in this game, in Smash. And the reason because of that is because previous to like really ultimate, and like yeah, some in melee, due to like some like shield pressure and like aspects there, but like because of that nature of that, like we were in situations where we just didn't have actual real like frame traps before, right? And now it's like we have that name. So I think that's like one of the big thing as we kind of go in this conversation. Because I'm definitely a resident master, right? I know Void is too, right? There's a couple of people, and I think sometimes when people have the idea of like, oh, it's just like mindless and whatever it may be. But I guess assuming like kind of what we're going to be talking about today is also just kind of like how because of the low end lag, how there's like kind of more like pressure and things that can be done, right? And so it's like, how do you navigate that? Because it is definitely a new thing. I feel like for like modern Smash. And so because of that, a lot of people really don't know what to do again and get really angry about it. Versus kind of have it like, restructuring their thinking about, okay, I can actually apply some more true pressure here now because of how this game operates. So that's like the biggest thing to me. Like I think that some people have this idea that like if you're pressing a lot of these buttons here, then it has to be stupid. There can't be any reason behind it, and therefore you're a moron, right? And like if you don't do that, then you are playing honorably, and that means that you are an intellect and you know what you're doing. And it's like, nah. So like like we got to address like how that actually operates. So that's the biggest thing for me. Just kind of start it off.
Yeah, for sure. Talking about in general, kind of like the trajectory of mashing, I think it's interesting talking about previous games as well. Because there was a huge shift between Melee and then like Brawl, Smash 4, and Ultimate, which often gets grouped together, right? And I think there's been another huge shift between Smash 4 and Ultimate. As much as people say like, oh, you know, like Smash 4 and Ultimate is relatively easy to kind of like transition between them, I think we've kind of like we felt that way because we didn't really understand the game well at first, and now we're kind of realizing that the skill set related to Ultimate is very distinctly different than the skill set that you need to succeed in Smash 4. And I think to me the core of that, as a game designer, I was thinking about this because I read a tweet about this, and I don't know who made it, but it was a tweet about crouch canceling in Melee, because every time like L canceling or crouch canceling or whatever comes up, people are like, that's lame, that should not exist. And someone posted and they said, well, crouch canceling is actually really important, because if someone is just spamming landing aerials, if they're mashing in Ultimate lingo, you can crouch cancel and counter it, right? Like if Marth is spamming short hop fair, you dash up, crouch cancel, and then you down tilt or down smash him, and then you counter his landing aerials, which is really nice, because if you look at the current meta of Ultimate, like we have these clouds running around spamming short hop landing back airs. We have a lot of like Mifra, like jump in there, right? So even Mifra tilts, right? Mifra tilts would get absolutely bodied by crouch cancel. And so what happens is that in most games, and this is ultra simplified, right? But in most competitive games, at least in terms of platform fighters, there's always a balance between like offense, movement, and defense, right? Which are often like interlinked to some degree, but that's again, you super simplification.
Yep.
And so what we've seen is that for Melee, the reason that game is so awesome is because all three of them have good balance. You have players who are aggressive and succeed. You have players who are just like essentially breaking your ankles and succeed. You have players who focus more on defense and succeed. And of course, everyone has a bit of everything, but there's like different focuses and you can succeed within them. But then if we look at like Brawl and Smash 4, these are games in which you basically had to focus more on your defense, because the offensive tools just weren't strong enough to open up defense for most characters, right? And so focusing on offense wasn't really an option. And so that's where we kind of got like that elitist, like more quote unquote disciplined patient play, because it's like that's how you succeeded in those games.
Right.
If you had the discipline to not mindlessly chase after your win condition, in other words, like hitting your opponents, first of all, hard to do, requires discipline. Second of all, it's successful, right? And so there was a little bit of elitism related to like this strategy. And now in Smash 4, suddenly I feel like the offensive tools for most of the cast, right? There's some unique character tools that are really strong defensively. But if we're talking about like system mechanics, I think offensive tools are outperforming defensive tools in this engine, simply because of landing aerials. Landing aerials in this game are crazy. And so if you look at mashing, like when people complain about mashing, what are they complaining about? Like Mifra tilts and nair, Roy nair, Cloud back air, Palutena back air and nair, right? Like all of these landing aerials and really low lag tilts, which all kind of like form the same offensive strategies essentially. And so we kind of have moved into a meta, an engine that rewards offense more than people are used to, or I should say that rewards initiative more than people are used to. And that is something that people have, well, in a lot of ways, kind of like dubbed as mashing. And we'll talk again, like Bam said, we're gonna get deeper into this over the course of the episode. But I think to me, really the underlying problem is undershooting, right? Essentially like missing a Crom nair on purpose and not being able to be punished. If you did that in Smash 4, you would get whiff punished. If you did it in Brawl, outside of Meta Knight, right? And in Smash 4, there were characters that could undershoot too. But most of the time, you undershoot, you get punished. And in this game, you undershoot, and most of the time, that means that you just got more stage control. It's actually a win. And so just that dynamic of like undershooting being strong, I think really lies at the core of mashing an offense in Ultimate. And that's all related to essentially having a lot of the offense that Melee does, of course not as much, but essentially like, you know, like Charles said, auto L canceling without the like 20 different defensive systems to counter someone who has L canceling.
So I'm under the impression that originally it started, to reiterate what Bam said, is that I think it was more of the idea of somebody just kind of pianoing the keys blindly, and on specifically on arcade cabinet style input controllers, which Smash is traditionally not founded on. So I think that was kind of mistranslated into Smash is just being the idea that you're not really looking at what you're doing, you're just doing it without intention, and that whatever happens happens. And so I think that's where it kind of becomes bereft of intent. And then of course, as Smash community is wont to do, we kind of incorporated that into our nomenclature with the mistranslation, and here we are. So uh, to iterate on what Ramsey said, I think that a lot of what things like, for example, the stale moves queue was implemented for, were so that specifically to kind of diversify gameplay. I think that that's something that the developer has kind of expressed with their intention, just based on the way they tend to both balance between games and also how they patch the game, so that the game or each game from the relative to the last encourages you to use more of a move set. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the move sets are increasingly balanced overall within a given character. The more to the point of mashing and ultimate, and part of the reason why I think it's so effective is I think that the game design team for ultimate recognized that ultimate aerials would be an issue when responding to the opponent, and I'm under the impression that that's why Smash 4 and then especially Ultimate have increased hit lag values so that these are relatively reactable to the player, because the idea is that what hit lag does is it's going to freeze the screen and kind of pause the game for you so that the player can catch up, and so that you can remove some of the human reactive element to the situation, and it's more of a puzzle solution. uh, Ultimate being so fast, some of the hit lag values are double digits. But the issue here is that even though the average human can react in double digits, the average human does not have input delay. Whereas in practice, when we're playing the game, you're going to have a variable number of frames. 6 to 7, I believe, is the number. Go
Yes,
ahead,
if you're
Ramses.
if you're not using the lossless adapter TM.
Yeah, here we
Yes,
go.
it's 6 to 7 for the plebeians, and if you're using a Mayflash, it's actually more closer to 7.
So the idea there is that we aren't living in a sterile environment when we're actually doing this. I don't know if the game design team balanced the game around that input delay. I'm under the impression that they did, just because of how often the average reaction time plus input delay comes up as a deliberate game design, like on a universal option. It just so happens that you almost always can exactly do that plus a universal punish. So whether it's a turnaround grab, uh, the ledge grab frame, for example, I think is approximately that number, et cetera, et cetera. So it could go either way, but the idea there is that whiffing or whiff punishing specifically is vulnerable to human reactions. That is, or invulnerable to human reactions, I should say, because you don't have that hit lag to compensate for your own human limitation. And so something that's particularly strong in Ultimate that is less strong in every other game because it's not balanced with the hit lag value in mind is just whiffing. As Ramsey said, the game is just not slow enough for you to do that and then react and have your input come out with the input delay. If we were playing Ultimate without the input delay, it would be a very different game. Reactionary play would be stronger than it is. And so I would like to go ahead and see us into what mashing is as a competitive element, and rather when it is appropriate to be mashing. And so traditionally what you are doing when you are mashing as a competitive player, and the reason we use this term is instead of being a matter of, oh, I'm pressing buttons without thinking, it the way we usually are going to refer to this is chunking, or the idea is that here that you have attack pairings or even triplets or such, where you say, I'm going to input my land, and then after I land, I'm going to input down tilt, and then after I down tilt, I'm going to jab, because I think that they're going to mash. And that doesn't even have to be the specific thought, but the idea here is that if you think that your opponent's going to be slow on the down tilt, then you will hit them with jab, even though it's not a true frame trap, as Bam said. It will act like one, because once you include the human element, if they're a little bit slow, you're going to get that jab punish, because it'll stuff whatever they're pressing that's too slow. And so the idea here is that you can either play to the future and kind of queue up your inputs. And this was how Brawl in particular used to be played. Is the idea is in order to increase your player speed, you should use the buffer window to kind of queue up your inputs, similar to something like an MMO, where you have set action orders for what you're supposed to be doing. And then it's all about executing that, and you can literally do it with your eyes closed because the inputs are actually fairly static. And same thing here, when you are mashing correctly in Ultimate, you should be able to do it with your eyes closed because you are not responding to any stimulus from your opponent. You are preemptively acting and saying, it's still my turn after I make the first action. I need to have my second action set up so that if you try to take your turn back too soon and you're not ready, you're going to get punished. And so I think that that's the more common way people are using it now, is just as an alternative for chunking once you start listening to high level players. And it is still a top level technique. You ask people about, I can think of quite a few top 10 players, and you hear them talk about each other. You'll hear he's a masher for sure.
Yeah,
Right.
no, 1000%, man. And yeah, just to add also context to, I know you were talking about in terms of like, frame trapping, and you're talking about like the kind of the true frame traps, right? I think sometimes people get this disillusioned, and it's funny enough. I think Sage made a video about it the other day too, talking about this. But this is something I try to tell people whenever they kind of talking about it. But like frame trapping, just because you are minus doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have a frame trap there, because it also is context due to like what space is there, right? Like if you have something that could hit me, like then there's difference, right? But if you have something that's okay, frame 2 that would beat out my option, but it's never going to touch me, then that option is irrelevant, right? So it's like, okay, I could jab here. It's like, oh well, your jab's not going to reach me, right? And then if your actual tool that you would have to use to like attack me here, um is that is going to take longer than when I do something, then I'm in a situation now where I can press these buttons, right? And I can, take my turn back, so to speak. And that's something that's really important too when, if you're sitting down as a player and you're trying to, say you're like a high level player and you're trying to just work on incorporating a lot of this stuff more so into your game plan, right? That's going to be some of the nuances that you're going to be looking at, right? It's not just going to be, oh, I need this to be like 0 in order for me to have plus. Like, no, there's like, you have to take all that nuance into account when you're formulating these things. But yeah, I think it's something that community wide, right? When you're talking that discussion and mashing, like it's good for people to really recognize what it is, right? And where there is a semblance of just pure nonsense, right? And it's just like there's no kind of thought behind where it may be. And then whereas there's actually like, okay, this is just offense that Ultimate allows, right? And again, the stress to a lot of people, there's a lot of this offense that you can find that's happens more so in traditional fighting games, because that's some of the like centerpieces of like offense in these traditional fighting games. It's just something that again is different for a lot of people who really haven't played the traditional fighters before. So I encourage people always to kind of see where you can like. I love me personally. I love taking things from different like competitive games and be like, how can this actually like, how is this brought into this game? Does this actually work in this framework, right? Is there some kind of semblance there? Because then that means you have this whole other group now you can look at and see, kind of learn from and gain knowledge and incorporate it in your gameplay. And I think that's like one of the most fascinating things, right? To see that connective tissue, right? That lies, in these kind of these general like gameplay elements. So yeah, I think it's good for people to recognize, going back to what we're talking about, just like for frame traps, understand that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be positive in that situation in order to create a frame trap, right? So
Yeah, and just to wrap up like some early game thoughts, some of the big points I really want to bring up is in Brawl, if you started competing in like Brawl or have competed in Brawl and Smash 4, you controlled space with run up shield. That was like the option. It was how good were you at either positioning your run up shield or how good were you at playing against run up shield, and you would run up and shield, and then it's from there it's like, okay, shield grab, did I position my shield close enough for them to miss space their aerials? Because here is the thing that makes me the most angry about Ultimate is you don't have to give a fuck about how you space your aerials in Ultimate at all. I know they're obviously like you can still space aerials in Ultimate, but like if you miss space your aerials in Ultimate and you're like 80 or 70% of the cast, you can probably mash an option afterwards. So the way I learned Smash is misspaced aerials means you get punished. Like, no, bad. Like, you don't do that. But in Ultimate, you can just do it and it doesn't fucking matter, right? Like, it's still your turn. And in fact, you get rewarded for it. So to me, I think that's what that specifically frustrated me a lot in early Ultimate. And dude, I hated going to locals and being like, there'd be people like, oh man, dude, Ultimate's my first Smash game. God, I'm so good at it. Da 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 da. Like, I feel like I'm picking up the game fast. I'm like, you're luck. Like, and it's like you think you're some kind of prodigy because you're picking up Ultimate quick, and it's like, no. Well, actually, I would brain wipe everything I know about Brawl and Smash 4, and I'd be better at the game because there's so many fundamental things that you learned in Brawl and Smash 4 that don't even not like it doesn't apply. It literally fucks you over. Like getting run up shield out of my system took like 1 to 2 years and stuff like that. Like, because there's these just fundamental things that are ingrained in your brain. Because in Ultimate, they changed so much things, right? They made shield grabbing take 4 more frames, right? So now if someone just has negative spacing skills and they suck at spacing, it doesn't matter because they can mash afterwards and it's still their turn, right? And then on top of that, they changed perfect shielding. So shield got nerfed in so many ways. And I think it's overall healthy for the game, right? Because Brawl and Smash 4, it was competitive was like pretty lame because it was like, okay, run up shield, roll away, run up shield. Are you going to roll in, run up shit, right? And then they also, I guess this is kind of a buff to shield, but like they changed jump squat, right? But they made it so you almost like teleport. I remember people playing the Ultimate beta or demo or whatever at E3, and they're like, yo, when I full hop, I feel like I'm like I like instantly teleport in the air. Like the travel time is way quicker, right? So that was a big change. So you can set up your crazy falling aerials, right? And then on top of that, they nerfed perfect shield and they made it parry. So like, just to put in a context how strong shield was, as you're running up and you're bringing up your shield, the beginning of you bringing up your shield, you could get a perfect shield, which is a parry. But doing that while you're bringing up your shield, think about how low risk that is. Like, you're bringing up the best option in the game, and if they just so happen to match as you're bringing up, oh, you get a perfect shield, automatic punish, like free dash up smash, because you could, if you perfect shield, you could just drop your shield and do whatever, right? And it would be no negative frames or nothing like that. So then they made it so you have to drop shield to get perfect shield, which buffed projectiles because now you're taking a bigger risk because there's like, you know, how many, I think it's like 11 frames to drop your shield. They also made dropping your shield from 7 to 11 frames. So that also took 4 more frames because there would be times in Smash 4 where I could shield something, drop my shield, and then dash attack as Fox, and it's like an easy punish, right? Now, obviously, that's like broken. And like I said, I agree with the changes they made because before, in the previous like current Smash game iteration past Melee, you controlled a lot of space with movement plus defense, right? Movement, shield, movement, shield, movement, shield. But in this game, now it's movement with hitboxes. Shielding is actually not that great. I think there are certain characters where obviously you can shield, like Game & Watch or Cloud. Like, obviously there's some characters with Bayo, right? There's still certain characters that have pretty good out of shield, but it's not as universal as before. And overall, I think it's good for the game. But I think what frustrated a lot of players in the beginning of the game is a lot of fundamental core things you were taught throughout competitive Brawl and Smash 4 were actually used against you, and newer players had an edge on you because of what you learned before, right? And I think at the end of the day, that's really, really annoying. And I mean, obviously, another thing too is people just weren't good at parrying. We had to get used to parrying, right? Like all these changes I'm talking about, even if they're only by like 4 frames, like that is a shit ton of time in competitive play.
It's huge.
And like you're trying to get used to parrying, you're trying to get used to like, oh wow, like, because even in Smash 4, Sheik forward air could be shield grabbed. Like if a Sheik missed space forward air, it wasn't like Sheik just got like some kind of block string or anything like that. No, like you could shield grab that shit. Anything that was misspaced in Smash 4, you could shield grab. But again, I mean, those are the big changes from early game. Now, so that's how mashing was effective early game, and I think players did get better at parrying and stuff like that. And I think mashing is still effective in this current meta, just because, again, I think the game is just more geared towards controlling space with movement and
Offense,
hitboxes.
for sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I think people now more so just understand the scenarios, right? Because before, especially when Ultimate came out, now imagine you played like over a decade of competitive play, and right, and it's like, okay, misspaced aerials equal grab. But then it's like, okay, in ultimate, like sometimes I can grab, sometimes I can't. Like which moves can I? Like there was so much information to take in. So I think nowadays we're still seeing players control space with mashing, but we're also seeing players that have specific tools that you can like whiff punish certain, even like with auto L cancel turned on. Like obviously there's like Diddy Banana, maybe certain projectiles, right? That you can kind of whiff punish some of these falling back aerials and stuff like that. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of wrap up my early or thoughts on early game mashing, but I feel like we can kind of transition into the current day. Let's, spin this clock forward here. And we're 5 years in. Mashing's still good. Oh, another system change that they did was mashing out of spot dodge. That never was a thing before. Spot dodge canceling. Right. So spot dodge canceling, you actually uh you're able to attack 4 frames earlier if you buffer an attack out of spot dodge, right? So even in like ultimate, things were so safe. Am I right on that, Ramses?
I think it's 5, but
5 frames? Okay, 4 or 5 frames. But essentially before, if you spot dodge, there would be an amount of end lag that you just had to deal with. In Brawl, there was some Z-axis shenanigans that characters had better spot dodges because of Z-axis, which is weird.
DDD,
the king, baby.
It was like DDD.
Talk about your boy.
Yeah, he had Falco, very broken.
Yeah, for sure.
Where they're supposed to be tangible, but their body was still in the Z-axis, so they had like better spot dodges. But that's another like really annoying thing about Ultimate, where it's like, oh, someone does something safe, then they go into a spot dodge. You think you can punish, you try to punish, and then not only are you going to get punished for trying to punish someone, but they're going to smack. They have 5 extra frames or 4 extra frames to smack you with something really hard hitting. Like I've seen people get punished out of spot dodge cancels with like a smash attack or like even tilt instead of a jab or a grab, right? Stuff like that. So there was a lot of system changes going into Ultimate, which kind of made mashing even more possible, along with everyone kind of like learning the ropes of Ultimate. And even now it's still just like really good. I think it's had the longevity. I think in terms of like what the devs wanted to do with the game, they wanted to promote less defensive play. They wanted to promote more movement and hitboxes, and that's exactly what we get. And there are characters that control a lot of space. Bayo aerial ABK is a move that's like she's mashing and she's like controlling a bunch of space and leaping, at plus moving at the same time. Not a lot of characters have a tool like ABK, but even just like undershooting aerials, like you're just kind of controlling space with hitboxes that most of the time you can't really do much about. And it's like a fight for positioning and stage control, but it's more movement hitboxes instead of like moving and shielding, right? So what do you guys, how do you guys feel about the current state of mashing and Ultimate? And I mean, even like some of the newer characters, especially Fighter Pass 2, I think has a lot of masher characters. And then oddly enough, one of the least mashing characters, Sephiroth, which is like, I always say, Sephiroth, if you ever want a blast in the past and you want to play Brawl, go play Sephiroth. Sephiroth is a Brawl character in Ultimate. He has ending lag on his moves. Yeah.
He tries to kill you at 0 though. That's the only difference. Like he wants to down air spike you, down smash you, break you. Like
he has some ultimate shit, but like at least in terms of like aerial landing lag, that was the feel of like almost every character in Brawl.
Yeah. So mashing current day. So at its core, right? As a competitor, the most important thing is consistency, because like it's easy to win. It's very hard to win consistently.
Yes.
And so the way people structure their game plans is that they will always start off by covering essentially a worst case scenario. This is called min-maxing, literally maximizing the minimum outcome, right? And so when you don't have information on what the opponent's going to do, you got to prepare for the worst. And so in previous games, how do you prepare for the worst? You would play defensively, right? Like you run up shield, and like worst case scenarios, they grab you, and like, is that really that big of a deal? Not really, because like it's super committal and blah blah, right? No, this game, because landing aerials straight up beat shield in a lot of ways, you cannot rely on defense in general for your min-maxing. And so your min-maxing now is kind of tied to your landing aerials, because like, what's the worst case scenario when you do a landing aerial, right? And in general, your movements. And so what you get is you get a meta where mashing is very powerful in combination with movements if your opponent's mashing beats yours. That's essentially what it comes down to. It's like, imagine we both mash. who wins? Okay, if you win, I'll move more. And if I win, you have to move more. And that's kind of like the starting point for most neutrals in today's meta. And so this is all kind of coming back to this idea of like, okay, defense is a lot weaker, so you have to like make up for it with movement and offense. Something that I think Tony said that I think is very, very insightful is how tightly this game has been balanced around reaction time. So reaction time is about 13 to 14 frames. Input delay is about 6 to 7, right? And so reaction time is generally about 20 frames. It kind of evens out, generally about 20 frames. But the one thing that people don't tell you is that when they quote this reaction time number, they're thinking about that one site where the screen is like green, and then when it turns red, you press, or the other way around, right?
That's always so funny.
That's not how reaction works.
Not at all.
Okay, so that is what is called a simple reaction. So a simple reaction is a binary reaction, yes or no. And so for a simple reaction, our reaction time is 13 to 14 frames. Now, if you get into complex reactions, so multiple options, it just falls into the fucking gutter, right? And so the cool thing is, if you think about like a simple reaction, so in other words, I think the opponent is going to do a landing aerial, yes or no. And so I see them jump, and that's the moment I react. How much time do I have? Well, funnily enough, a short hop fast fall for most meta characters is about 25 frames. A dash attack for about meta characters, for most meta characters, is about like 5 to 10 frames. And so if you react to a jump, which like the jump itself is like 25 frames, add like a jump squad, that's like 28, or yeah, 28-ish, right? You get 20 frames to react and 8 frames to do your dash attack. And so if you anticipate a jump and you react perfectly to a binary reaction, you can perfectly beat out a short up aerial with a whiff punish. Given that you read where they land, if they fast fall, when they do the aerial, if they do an aerial at all, the early drift, the late drift, etc., etc. Like you have to read everything. But if you do, you can do it on perfect reaction. And so what we kind of have is we have a meta too, where if you're undershooting, it is so powerful that people do it a lot, right? If you get countered, that also tells you that they're specifically waiting for you to undershoot. And now you're essentially controlling the game, right? Because they're playing around your undershooting 100%, because that's the only thing they can react to. If you then make their reactions more complex by giving them more things to think about, suddenly we get into a point where the focus is less on the actual actions and more about the management of mental stack. And that is honestly where most metas eventually evolve into, where it stops being about the thing you're doing and more about the things you could be doing, essentially, right? And so that is how I think about present day mashing in current time. I think it's just a very strong min-max strategy. And with that, if you want to be specific, I specifically mean undershooting. I think undershooting is a very min-max strategy. And all of the other variations of mashing are way more related to essentially the character specific tools. So if we think about something like wolf mashing, so Charles said, hey, you should always get punished for unspaced moves. Well, Wolf is a character that can really struggle with spacing, because if he does do his moves unspaced, he has no follow pressure, right? He would have to go into essentially a bad mix-up, like trying to spot dodge. And I know spot dodging is broken. By the way, spot dodge 20 frames, and then your tilt starts in about like 5 frames. Again, that's a 25 frame window. It's the same thing as a short hop. So very intentionally bounced around that, right? But yeah, so there are characters that can still struggle with, for example, the spacing elements of things, like a Sephiroth, a Wolf, a Shulk, a Palutena. And then there's characters that that cannot really rely on spaced options, like a Roy, because he has to be up close, right? And so oftentimes what we see is a very like a handshake neutral, where it's like, okay, I'm gonna undershoot, you're gonna undershoot. And then from there, it kind of transforms into more character specific stuff. And I think that's also why we see so much like Steve, because he can kind of like bypass this entire dynamic. Well, we see him succeed so much because he can bypass the entire dynamic. And then people are like, well, he's not fundies. And well, you know, in a lot of ways, he's not, because he just doesn't follow these rules, right? He has walls, and walls kind of like form an obstacle before you play any sort of like quote unquote standard neutral. But yeah, I think in that sense it's cool, because essentially if you want to simplify it a lot, dash shield has been replaced by undershooting and aerial. And in a lot of ways it does a very similar thing. It defends a space it prevents the opponent from moving forward aggressively. And if the opponent decides not to move forward aggressively, you can then use that space to do other things. And what the other things are is dependent on the character. And I think that is a cool dynamic. I really think it is.
Yeah,
A lot more fun to
absolutely.
watch. I'll tell you that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely a lot more fun to watch.
You know that meme of like, you remember when
Smash
we
board?
would dash shield and
Yeah.
you would dash shield and we'd look at the neutral.
Yeah.
That's yeah.
Both players
Yeah.
then roll away. Like,
Yeah.
Yes.
Remember Ninja Link, he'd always like when they come together, he'd always be like, "Oh, there's the Venn diagram," because everyone just dash shielding each other, and then they would like overlap slightly,
Overlap.
and then yeah, so it'd always be like, "Oh, there's the Venn diagram."
That's great. That's
Yeah,
great.
shout out to Ninja Link, but yeah, man, absolutely, like you said, I love that. Obviously, Tony, you were talking about it, and Ramsey, you're going to detail about it too. You know how a lot of these things like are seemingly intentional. I also think even just the way this nuance goes in terms of like how now we have the frame trapping and the undershooting and stuff like that is intentional. And the reason why I keep talking about this stuff being a part of traditional fighting games is, of course, right, when we talk about these past 2 games, right, the team that was helping Sakurai was Bandai Namco, right? And so there's a lot of these things that feel very odd to a lot of people if you're coming from like a traditional Smash mindset. But again, a lot of offensive and a lot of fighting games like actually revolves around this, which is like so fascinating to me. Even if you look at the game that Smash was inspired by, KOF is like dominated by a lot of those things, right? Given that those mix-ups and then getting your jump in, your short hop heavy,
Short hop.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah, right. You're a short hop, your D, and you go ham, right? And you get your free pressure, right? So there's a lot of those nuances that are actually like baked into the game, right? And it's almost like it's kind of coming back to that like what its inspiration is, which is like really interesting. But like again, like if you are coming from a point when you're starting from Brawl and Smash 4, like it is very jarring, right? It is very, very jarring how we kind of went there. But it's interesting nonetheless that people are getting to a point right now in the meta, like you're saying, where it's like, okay, so now people have to be like, okay, I think you're going to be here for your undershoot, and now I have to go things where I'm like with punishing you here, right? And people have to be like, or like, okay, I'm going to be in a situation where now like we're going in like you were talking about earlier, Ramses, right? Where you're going to go and like kind of people are going to be undershooting and putting their feints out essentially, right? And then eventually it's okay, I get to jump in, that's going to give me like a pressure and a reward there where it's kind of going to mix up, then I can move from there. And it's like it's very interesting, right, that people have kind of gotten to a point now where they have gotten progressively better at this. I think that's why even too, like, you had some characters that would like kind of struggle back in the day too when it came to this, but more and more you're seeing them like come into being. I feel like even like how Light has had his like resurgence. I always talk like it's interesting as like time has progressed, how he's been able to kind of be more in the forefront and be able to do bigger things. And I think that's partly too because as people more understand how the offense plays in this game, right? You can use your speed to get those whiff punishes. You understand where you can go and actually apply your pressure there that you normally wouldn't necessarily be able to do because like now people have to respect those kind of aerials on landing, right? It's almost like a, to again use traditional fighting game terms, like now these aerials are almost kind of like a safe jump, right? Like it's like because they are like I can jump on you and it's like I can kind of do something here, but then I also can kind of like step back and you can't really do anything to me here. So I have that like you have to respect that like point, and then so people will go, I have a time to do some kind of offensive mix up there, or maybe I'm just going to do that aerial and then come back, right? But it's fascinating to see those kind of things come to life in Smash for me personally, and see that from characters. Obviously, Steve is a hard one, and I think that's where we're kind of getting how everyone felt about like the beginning of Ultimate. I feel that's the way people feel about Steve because it's so like nebulous. This character just does so many things, right? And it's like I can stop at any point in time my aerial because I'm doing a block or I'm doing this here, right? And it's like there's just so many different things in tandem with like the nuance with like, oh, if I'm using gold or if I'm using diamond or this, like, there's so many other like avenues with this character, right? That makes it like I think for a lot of people, just like it's just like overtuned. It's annoying, right? Like no one wants to deal with that crap, and it's like that's something like just for that single character is going to take people a long time to really kind of break down and understand the nuances, as people have eventually done for I would say like the majority of the cast right now in Ultimate, right? People kind of understand now. And so while they're still strong options, people know why they're strong options and they can actually punish accordingly if someone's just doing it just to do it, right? You still have to have some kind of thinking beyond it now versus early Ultimate. Yeah, some people they were just jumping on you and like we didn't know how to punish it, so they just jump on you and they just keep doing it, and it's like so it's like, hey, this guy's just swinging around, and this is all new for everybody, so everyone's just like, oh, sick, let me just do that, and I'm just winning, right? But over time, people got better once they understood what is actually happening. And again, it's another thing too, because we talk about it quite often. There's so many characters in this game, overall balance in this game in comparison, right? So it's like all of that with a game system that favors that kind of offense and that initiative there. Like, yeah, you're going to have like for a long time, there's people just like frustrated because it's the same. Like if I just thought to myself, I'm just going to run up on you and see what happens, then, at that early Ultimate, it felt like you were in a good spot, right? But it took time for people really to break it down.
So to take on the spacing element that Charles is referring to, I think that that's more of a timing element, and Ultimate in particular. And I know I've said it before, but Ultimate is a rhythm game, and when you do things is just as important as where you do it, if not more so. And so the idea here is similar to what Ramses was talking about, and what we have discussed on this channel before is the same concept as like high-low aerials, and that you are generally looking at a dynamic where if you put out your fastest possible aerial, you are getting it out there so that the hitbox exists as soon as possible, which gives your opponent less time to mash out their own option if you think that they are going to try and do the same. And so if you are winning that situation, then it's your turn. You press your button, but as Bam said, even if your opponent is going to have you as minus, if they don't have something that reaches you, which still brings it back to space, then you're not really that minus. And so I think one of the more traditional examples that we see in top level a lot, it would be like Mia's nairs with Game & Watch. So Game & Watch's neutral air is generally like a -4, -5 aerial. However, the way we usually see that nair used at top level is not actually perfectly vertically spaced or timed. And so usually this makes it just slightly less safe, so that usually what you're getting is a -6 version. And so the issue on this is that the difference between -4, -5, and -6 is very large once you start getting into like top tier out of shield options. This means that it's the difference between being able to, for example, Wario has, I believe, a frame B out of shield, and so that's something that can reach Game & Watch. Diddy Kong has a frame 5 up smash that can reach Game & Watch. However, if Game & Watch were to actually do it perfectly instead of just going willy-nilly on the timing, then all of a sudden it's actually possible for Game & Watch to get there. And so once you reach top level, the difference between doing something frame perfectly or not will be relevant. And so usually what you see is then Mia will adapt to this. He'll actually intentionally pull back just a little bit extra far so that even though there's enough time for Wario to be there, he'll be just outside of space. The problem, though, is that the cost of that space is he's taking a bit more time to reach it. And so instead of being something that was -6 because he pulls back for a little bit extra drift, usually what happens is he's not in space to present a jab or reshield on his own. And so Wario is now spaced to go for parries. But because that neutral air is not reaching Wario, even if the parry is mistimed or Mia does something else to try and throw off that timing, he's not close enough in space to then hit Wario after. And so Wario basically gets to go for free parries. And so what you'll see if you watch like a Gluto versus Mia is in this example, you can kind of see Gluto and Mia navigating that little space. And so usually what happens is if Wario and Game & Watch move at the same time, Game & Watch wins. And so what you have is you have Wario move, and then usually Mia gets out his nair, which he's mashing. Usually he'll do it with a shield drop, cancel that into a rising nair so that he can option select for parry, which in this case, that means option select in this case means he will always get a parry if Gluttony had tried to mash faster.
Mm-hmm.
to beat his own nair. And so it's actually, there is a very small window where Gluttony can stuff that nair. But if he's too fast, he gets parried. If he's too slow, he just loses the mash mirror. And so the idea here is that it's not an advantageous position for Wario. And so through the threat of Mia's mash, and because Mia's mash is so fast, because he's essentially getting out not just nair, but parry into nair, and then he's usually positioning himself so that he's going into another strong position. What Wario wants to do is he wants to essentially try and set up when he's going to have that mash. And so controlling that frame of lag and where that one extra frame is going to be on that window is essentially what top level scrambling comes down to, because both players are usually familiar with the situation, the puzzle that is happening, and both players are already know what their game plan is and what they want from it. So it's just a matter of executing and then fighting each other to see if they can bait the other person into being a little bit too consistent in their game plan. That also requires you to be consistent enough to execute. So even when both players are mashing, you can have both players make the same inputs on paper. Once you get into that frame perfect territory, athleticism enters the conversation. Can you actually input this 100 out of 100 times? And if your opponent can't, you're probably going to win, even if everything else is equal. So top level definitely still has nuance on this equation. There's a lot that goes into it. There's still that dynamic between timing and spacing, as Bam and Ramses mentioned. And like that nuance, though, like that requires you to actually be familiar enough with these situations. Like Charles said, if you don't know what's happening and you're going in there, best thing you can do is just get out of there. Like if you're not ready to mash, if your mash isn't winning, do what Ramsey said. Get out of there, reposition, find a place where your mash is going to win.
Yeah, and just to add real quick, I love that you kind of brought up the option set, because I do think that that is something that players are getting a bit better at, right? Because they're recognizing the value in these kind of nuanced situations, right? Where they can essentially stack the deck in their favor, so to speak, right? That's really the power of that, especially in a game where there's so many like variables in Smash. If you're able to reduce those by like a couple, right? Like that's huge, right? And you are seeing a bit more players utilize that stuff. Obviously, we see them utilize the stuff in terms of like kind of juggling too, if they're going to on hit versus whiff and all those kind of things. But that's where you see some of these people play extremely fast, right? I know people always talk about how fast Light is and how fast Spargo is, right? And a lot of that comes the idea, their understanding of like, where can I buffer these things where on hit I'm going to get a different response versus whiff, right? Where I don't have to sit there and confirm that. So I'm already moving, right? I'm flying all over the place. And at the same time, the moment I get a hit, that hit lag presents itself. I recognize that. I can move forward from that. And like, but it's like this is already doing that part for me. So I have additional time to really structure what I'm doing. Like that's how these people are playing at such a high speed, right? And getting these extremely crazy reads. And also too, that's where you always see the thing, wow, Mia is doing up being there, and I always get punished. Why doesn't he get punished? He's doing theirs a little bit different than yours, right? You don't see the frame, but he's doing a little bit different than yours, right? There's a little bit more nuance that's going into it, right? And that is everything. That is the difference, right? At this top level, dealing with these like kind of scramble situations, when people are putting these active hitboxes out, the mashing and everything like that too.
Between the lines.
Yeah, between the lines, man.
Yeah. And I think in terms of like characters, Steve and Game Watch obviously really strong mashers. Sonic can kind of mash in certain scenarios, but I think Sonic is more of like hit run, like run up, stance change, right? Am I canceling out of the stance change? Am I going to like rip one of these like really strong moves that is like, I mean, I guess when you're ripping the spin dash, it's kind of like mashing. It's a very strong like offensive option, but you have to get X amount of charge. It's just so broken because he's the fastest character in the game that he can disengage and set up the charge very easily. Like think if Sonic was slow, then it's like he couldn't disengage from people and automatically set up the charge, right? That would be a big deal. But I think another thing that frustrates people a lot about pairing is, or not pairing, mashing, is that parry doesn't automatically counter mashing, especially when we start breaking down like top level mashing, right? Like a perfect falling back air from cloud, drifting away, like parry, shield, it don't matter, bro. It's like, it just isn't enough to get the punish. And if it is enough to get the punish, like you have to be like a Fox or like someone with like a frame 2 jab with really long range, or like a frame 3 or 4 tilt with really long range, or like parry into like instant dash attack. And maybe if you have like a frame 4 dash attack and it goes really far, you might be able to get it right. I think that's another thing that just really frustrates people about mashing, because it's like, oh, if I know my opponent is going to throw a hitbox, like what am I quote unquote supposed to do? Like in the base game engine, what are you supposed to do? The answer is parry to attempt to give you the most amount of frame advantage. But the frame advantage is so skewed in the favor of the top tier, right? That with these top tier falling aerials, like there are scenarios where you literally have to parry just for positioning, which I think is a bit absurd. I know a lot of people, especially in the beginning of Ultimate, was like, man, you only get I believe you freeze them for like 3 frames. In terms of like frame advantage, I believe you only get like three frames of frame advantage or something like that. So I wish it was
3 more than normal. Yeah. So if
Yeah.
it's like
Plus that
minus
lag.
2, it becomes -5 essentially.
Yeah.
right. So it's
The
like
hit lag addition helps for reactions on
Yes.
like tight
And what to do.
situations
Yeah.
too.
Mhm.
right, but it's just I wish we got like maybe 5 or something like that with some of the more ridiculous arrows.
Mhm.
And even if it was 5, even then some of the shit characters just wouldn't be able to do anything. And then only the top tier, because even when you look at top tiers, a big thing is like, how is your punish out of parry game? Like I think that's a huge deal about Fox. What makes him so strong is he can almost punish almost everything in the game with parry dash attack, right? Because it's such a like fast option or something like that. And then he can always parry up tilt or parry jab anything in the game as long as he's in range, right? It's like this is a very privileged character when it comes to frame data. And I think another thing that's frustrating about, like, even if we're talking about, I guess, projectile mashing or just like someone spamming projectiles, is there's a range on how the freeze works with parrying. So it's like, okay, I'm doing something riskier than perfect shield from the previous game, right? And then it's riskier, and I don't even get any reward if they're like so far away from me. I think that is another thing where it's like the game engine in the game that is supposed to like counter hitting, and there is a lot of risk loaded into it, is not really that good at countering the hitboxes and stuff like that. And there are still specific windows, but man, I just wish you got a little bit more for parrying, just because of how much riskier they made it. I would understand if it was like the perfect shield system or something like that, where it's like you're not really taking a lot of risk. But because parrying is drop shield, there is a lot of things that open up in terms of option selects. And you can also cancel jump. You can cancel your shield drop frames with jump, which is also like you
Mhm.
can set up a bunch of. So it opened up a lot of cool OSs, but it's just there. I think it just took the community so long to kind of figure out these situations, because like the black and white tools that were presented to us year 1 and year 2 were not so black and white. And it's like, oh well, we gotta
Mhm.
decipher this and decipher that. Was it full hop? Was it short hop? Right there are so many different variables that go into it. Another thing that I think mashing changed a lot about the game, since defensive options like shield isn't as strong, is corner pressure matters, I think, the most in when you think about like
Yes.
Brawl, Smash 4, and Ultimate, because there's 2 big things that changed corner pressure is added the addition of unit collision. So when you were trying to corner like Fox or Sonic in Smash 4, I don't care. Run through you. Like, and while
Yep.
I'm running
See ya.
at you, you better respect me, because I could dash attack and murder you, right? So it's like, okay, so you're probably shielding. I just run through your shield. I could pivot grab. I could just get stage control. So the addition of unit collision, there's so many like base game mechanics that change so much about the game. But one thing I do enjoy about all these changes is putting someone in the corner and getting a positional advantage really does matter. And I think a big part of that is because of how strong mashing is, because it's like, oh, okay, well, if I just shield in the corner, the defensive options just aren't that great anymore, right? So then you have to deal with these hitboxes. They're very, very strong on blocks, so you can't really just kind of cradle your way through with running through your opponent, or using shield to just bypass the scenario. And I mean, shield
Mhm.
does recharge pretty quick, but you usually don't have that much time. You usually have to take pretty large guesses of like, okay, I have to kind of commit with like a rising aerial or a dash attack to catch their jump. I have to try to roll through one of their like hitboxes, or I try to like full hop over or full hop double jump over. Hopefully, if I'm on Battlefield, there's like some platform mix and stuff like that. But it definitely feels like, I know mashing is frustrating, but it definitely overall, I think it's better because it gave a specific flow to the game where it's like, okay, you get rewarded for, for out positioning your opponent. You get rewarded for, I guess you get punished for retreating, right? Since you can't just like run up and you can't offensively use defense. That's what I always say about the older games. Like you could use defense offensively, but in this game, it's more like you're using hitboxes offensively with movement, right? So because of that, you have to deal with all of these very advantageous positions for your opponent because you chose to retreat, which I think is very, very healthy for the game. Even though we have to deal with, characters like Fox, Cloud, Steve, Game Watch, mashing in neutral, there are still scenarios where you can kind of wait out the mash. And as frustrating as it is, where it's like, I think a baseline frustration is I know what my opponent is going to do exactly, but there are still scenarios where it's like, even if I know what they're going to do, I can take the guess, I can go for this move, but the reward is so skewed in their favor. Is it really worth me taking the risk and doing that rising aerial that I don't even get a combo off of, right? Or is it really, it always feels not in your favor, but you have to look at the game. It's not as black and white because positioning is so big, right? So if they're retreating with their aerials and you know they're going to retreat, but you don't want to take the risk, you have to take these small W's like the positional advantage, right? And I think that is kind of where I want to pivot the conversation to kind of wrap things up is, mashing from the beginning to now and how it positively affects the game. Even though there are frustrating scenarios, like I think the game being more about positioning is so big to me, at least. And I think it makes it way funner to watch, way funner to play, especially after you get like used to it. Obviously, like the first couple years of Ultimate, I was very jaded, but kind of just being more open-minded and being like, oh, okay, well, I mean, it was like this before, but now it's like this. And what are the pros? What are the cons? Right. I think there's definitely more pros than cons overall.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like to go to what you were already talking about, right? What you were alluding to, like the idea of how the corner is actually a real corner now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that we don't have characters just flying through people, right? And it's like, think about that fact that we could run through people and also aerials were laggier. So, like, a lot of times when you had someone in the corner, it's like,
It didn't mean
They
how
get
much
out.
is this really worth? Yeah, because it's like, what am I, if I swing and they shield, I lose, right? Like, they're not going to swing. So we're just in this weird stalemate, and then someone's going to run away or whatever, right? And it's like, it was just very like, in comparison to like everything else is just like odd, right? Like it wasn't something that really like people were too fond of. But like in this game, it's like, yeah, if I'm in a corner, I have you in the corner, right? You're in a situation now, you have not that much space, right? So you have little movement, right? Your hope is some people like the full hop, right? But even people have gotten better at that, but also trying to be how am I gonna position my aerial so I can kind of catch if you look for a jump here, but at the same time have it relatively safe. So I'm still able to pressure you, right? So I'm still getting rewarded for that position. Like position is so much in this game now, right? And people are just getting better about it, both in terms of like just like your juggling, even like your true combos. Like people now, it's like, oh, if I get you on back in the day, if you got someone on the platform, and no one was like, all right, okay, I'm on a platform, maybe I'll get a little hit or whatever. Now it's like, dude, if someone does this move that like doesn't even really combo into anything, but it puts me on the platform, oh no, like I could just get robbed, right? Because that's like now, oh, you're on the platform now, though that's free. I'm gonna get this landing up air, gonna land on this platform, get you with something else here. If I'm Roy, I'm getting 4 more up airs, right? It's just like that's the kind of nuance that we have in the game, right? So I think that with having offense the way it is, now you have position is so much more like valued. And so like even it like going back to like some of these characters now, right? Some of these characters, how they go about even their throw game, some stuff how it now has more importance because of those other avenues of the game, right? Because position is so important. So I really, really do love that aspect of Ultimate. And I think that going to what you were talking about in terms of like parrying stuff too, right? Utilizing that stuff in those situations is great as well. I think that stuff is going to take time. There's a lot of things in this game. It's weird because I think sometimes, I remember in the early years, everyone's like, oh, Ultimate's kind of solved, right? And blah, blah, blah. And it's like, oh, no, dude. Like, there's going to be, it's going to take a while. There's a lot of, like, it's like but again, it's a lot of nuance. It's not these like big leaps, right? This crazy stuff. And so sometimes, like, you know, to the untrained eye, it seems like it's like more or less like a little bit the same here and there, right? In some avenues. But again, it's like really that, like, because there's like these a lot of these specific situations with all these different characters and all these things, where if I'm getting those few more frames here and there, like that changes the game dramatically, right? But it takes time for people to recognize that, understand these characters, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, um, yeah, I do love that positioning. It matters more so they're in actively filling the space. I also think that a lot of times the games that people really, really enjoy tend to have like that tends to be a big thing, like occupying space with aerials, right? And having the space and moving around in that way, right? You know, shout outs to Marvel too. Like that was the idea. You want to cover space, sections of the screens with hitboxes, and that's how you apply your pressure and get people there into positions and etc. And people enjoy that stuff. Like, yeah, sometimes people be like, "Oh my gosh, this is so ridiculous," you know, I can't pass blah blah blah. But at the same time, like I think that sensation, like there's an overall joy with that kind of like gameplay loop for a lot of people. So um like I love it. I love seeing it. Obviously there's you know, some characters that we that people don't all enjoy, but I think in terms of, if you're looking at the general system and general how a lot of characters play, it's really nice to see.
I'll do a doomer final take
Okay.
to mix it up.
Oh yes, bring us home, baby.
Okay, so I'm always like on paper, and I think on paper the ultimate system is really really good. I think the thing you run into is that in practice it leads to a very high variance game, where I was talking before about how the basis for neutral is often like, if I mash and you mash, the person who wins kind of uses undershoot to set a pace, and the person who loses kind of relies more on movement, because if he would mash, he would lose to the opponent's mash, right? So like he cannot mash because mash loses to mash. And while that is very true on paper, in this game, the difference between your mash winning and losing can be literal frames and pixels, and that is not fun. There is a very high degree of unreactability in this game due to the high input delay native to the Switch. 6 to 7 frames is frankly quite absurd. I know the modern fighting games we're looking at like less than a frame, right? Like it's just not on the same level. Add to that the shitty buffer system. We're 5 years into the game and people are still like, you take a 10-second clip of people playing neutral and you'll find a misinput at the very least, right? Like there's gonna be flubs, like small ones, but they're there, right? And like Tony said, that little bit of lack of frame perfectness is going to change the entire outcome of the situation. And so you can go into a situation, perfectly gauge what's going on, go for your quote unquote mash because your opponent cannot beat it, and then lose out because you were a pixel or a frame off on your, because you reacted late, not because you react late, but because the game just puts a 6 to 7 frame barrier in front of you, because the hurt box shifts in this game are absolutely toxic, because there are 80 plus, there's like 90 matchups in this game, that you just cannot get familiar with all of them and all of the micro situations. And so a game that is reliant on offense the way that Ultimate is, being marred by hurt box shifts, matchup unfamiliarity. You can argue they're similar, but I think they're distinct enough to mention. Input delay and just general, I will say clunkiness, right? It means that it is very, very hard to play a consistent neutral if you are a quote unquote non-mashy character. So what we see at the top is the characters that, like, let's say there are 10 different situations in neutral. Again, oversimplification, 10 different situations in neutral. If your character can mash in 9 of them, your character is going to do better because you don't have to recognize an exact situation. You just have to recognize this is one of the 9 situations, and then you press the button. And so if you're a character that cannot rely on mashing as much, you're going to be in a really tough spot because it is literally impossible for you to accurately recognize the situations in which you can press a button. And so what these players often have to rely on is putting themselves in a situation where they could press a button and then seeing if the opponent gets antsy and using that antsiness to essentially get their button. That's kind of what it comes down to. And I think that is not cool. I think that's just the best way to put it. I don't think that's cool. But I think it's just it just is what it is. The game is just a little too polished. It's just a little too polished, a little bit too a few characters too many, a little bit
Few
too
characters
much.
too many, for
Exactly,
sure.
too much hurtbox shifting. And so like I think for Melee especially, right? And I'm not an expert on Melee. I competed in Melee like 10 years ago, but like I'm not an expert on Melee. But I do think a big reason why the game succeeded is because the competitive roster is small, right? And so, of course, outside of that, a lot of the modern improvements help as well, like faster melee, etc.
Yeah, better
And we
netcode
just
than
don't
ultimate, you know.
better netcode, so you have more practice. Yeah, more resources, more. Like if I want to learn Shulk versus fucking Isabel, good luck. It doesn't exist. It does not exist, right? If you want to learn Fox versus Marth, here's 20 years of VODs, right? Like you can watch Smash 64 Marth versus Fox because they modded him in. No, yeah. So
It's more focused.
that's exactly that's my doomer point. My doomer point is that it's a beautiful system in entirely the wrong context, which makes it higher variance than it should be. And that's to me what makes the mashing part of the game frustrating is that there are times where you are by all means correct, but you're still rolling die simply because there's there's more human limitation than there should be. And that's if that is something that you think is still cool, because there are ways to look at that as cool. You can say like, okay, that means that there is always going to be the potential for the upset, and that means that you can never be 100% sure, right? Like there's no getting it down to a science. And like if you think that's cool, I think all the more power to you. Again, I don't think it's super cool, but I do think, like Charles said, it makes for a better spectator sport for sure. That said, there's a lot about the system that you can appreciate, and I think just shifting gears for all people who are frustrated with mashing, I think shifting gears and looking at it from a perspective of, okay, how can I play the system rather than trying to essentially force your own principles on a system that does not know what a principle is. I think that is a really, really good starting point.
So I'm going to go ahead and first agree with what Ramses said, but
1000%.
I am very excited for it as a cool dice rolling scientist who.
You are the dice roll man. That's true.
Yes, I'm a big fan of the strategic dice rolling, and I think that there's still a lot of consistency in that. So maybe we'll see it change, but like if you look at the year-long win rate records of like the top 4, top 5 players in Ultimate, it is insane. If you told me that that was from a week of performance, I would believe you. You tell me it's a year and you showed me that paper, I probably would be skeptical as a person who believes the Ultimate is more consistent than people give it credit for. It is incredible how consistent these players are. Like there's, it genuinely just boggled my mind.
Top 4 is insane.
Like you have number 8, I think, had like 0 unranked losses for an entire year, entering double-digit majors, like entering weeklies. It's just incredible. And it was Yoshidora with Yoshi. Like we're not talking some super busted top tier. Like it's just there's a lot of skill gapping still already present in the game, but I also think that it's continuing to escalate, which we can see from, if only from players like Sonics, who just have just a current linear improvement rate that we can see in real time. Like if he hasn't slowed down, and so I think that it's fair to say that if one person is doing it in the game allows that. So yeah. I also think that even if that is the next stage of the game, that might not be the final stage of the game, if only because I'm pretty sure Melee was considered solved several years ago, and then several years before that, yeah.
So we have some time in this game for sure.
Yeah,
and people are getting. I mean, people are using training mode a lot more now too, right? So like we're getting more and more people kind of accelerating things too, which is great, right? And like understanding, even like how hurtbox shifts happen in certain combos and stuff too, right? And why these miss and stuff. So like there's more tools now than ever before to get to the next stage. Like I don't like Melee would not be where it is right now, like without 20XX and all these things, right? Like that's not even close. Right, we would not see that level of the game. We would not see resurgence certain characters that we probably thought just like would be complete trash, couldn't even do anything. We have people showing some crazy stuff with Samus right now in Melee, right? Like some insane stuff, and it's like, but that was stuff that like no one need to even ideate on, right? Because of just how the game was. So Yeah,
Well, even just R.O.B and Ultimate, we
Mhm.
have to completely rethink the character because a top R.O.B decided to lab with the wrong top B. And so
one day.
actually, so like we're getting more like high and top tier characters that aren't necessarily like dominant meta threats that are completely revamping their games. And like of course I never gonna leave Mega Man out of the conversation for characters that we already know have plus aerials that kill and start combos like that, and we just don't see these setups. So like there's just so much left to develop these characters that we already know is there, that we're just now getting into, and like Bam mentioned, like we're just now seeing it ideated. So like the implication behind R.O.B having that up B, like what are you going to do to stop it? Because that means that you're going to start attacking R.O.B more. But if you're attacking R.O.B more, then he doesn't even have to use his 2 projectiles to bait you out. And so instead of having to use his projectiles to bait you at approach, he can now counter hit you with the projectiles. Like there's just so much more play to the character, just realizing the frame data implication of a single movement option that was already not used. So there's Ultimate's a pretty deep game.
Yeah, there's a lot of little things, and that's the weird thing about Ultimate, right? Like it's not like these kind of, you're not going to find this huge new tech here, tech here, tech there, but there's a lot of little things that kind of add up over time and just like produces this like crazy result, right?
You guys know Rodney Mullen? He's like the inventor of street skateboarding. He's a very cool guy. And something that he's always said is that like these new developments, they are never revolutions. They're always like buildups of like a million little things just coming together in a new way as soon as like that final puzzle piece comes into play. And I think that's exactly what we've been seeing with Leo reinventing the meta, Spargo reinventing the meta, Sonic's introducing a whole new character, the way Akula's playing right now. And it's just it's been building up, and it's going to continue to build up as time goes on.
Yeah, as long as the game has time and people are playing it, man, we're going to continue to see this game evolve. I think a lot of us kind of saw like early from the onset. Like I was always telling day one, I'm like, dude, this game is going to be, it's wine. This game is wine, 100%. Right? It's about if it gets there, because to Ramsey's point of view, right? Like there is situations where you get to where people are going to be annoyed, they're going to be frustrated, right? Because it's so much, right? So much, so many variants, and like when you have that, something could be extremely complex and all those kind of things, but it's like if you don't understand it and it's like all these things all at once, you know what you call that? That shit is random. And if it's random, most people are upset, right? And so, it's like, random or complexity beyond your understanding, that shit looks the same to you until you get to that point, right? And so that's really what ultimately is like. Is it going to get to that point for for some people it feels like they're getting there and they love it, right? And they're pushing it forward, right? And they're moving it forward. But how long is the overall community going to be invested in it to that point, right? And who knows, right? If we get another Smash title on the horizon, like rumors suggesting, then probably that's the end of that, but if this stays around for a while, who knows? We may see some things.
I'll be here.
I'll be here.
Yeah, hopefully we get a new Smash title soon. That's what I'm hoping. Throw the wine out. I'm out of here,
Get
bro.
this random shit out of here.
Throw the wine out. Give me a new Smash game.
We're gonna upgrade to the Coaches Lounge.
Yeah,
the Coaches
yeah.
Lounge.
Finally.
We could get a deluxe version. Who knows? But yeah,
Coaches Corner Deluxe.
There we go. Yeah, deluxe version. All right, but that's going to be it for us talking about mashing. Hope you guys enjoyed the episode. If you guys did, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to let us know in the comments, which character do you think is the biggest masher in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Until next time, class dismissed.